Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, Member of Parliament, Garnett Genuis. If this is your first time encountering the Resuming Debate podcast, please do note that we publish weekly. We are present on all of the major podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and we cover a broad range of topics that interest me as a member of the Canadian Parliament. Sometimes we're talking about history and its implications for today. Sometimes we're talking about Canadian political issues, international issues. One issue that we have talked about previously is this whole emerging discussion around blockchain and cryptocurrency. It's something that I think we're seeing more discussion of in Canadian politics in particular, and just debate about the current realities of and potential of this technology. Of course, a lot of people have heard about Bitcoin, but cryptocurrency is larger than just Bitcoin, and blockchain technology is a larger category still. So lots for us to explore, and folks can check out that earlier episode for a bit of an introduction to this topic. One thing that some of you will know about me is that I also serve as what's called the shadow minister in our caucus for international development. And although this whole area of blockchain and crypto is newer to me, I'm very involved in and excited about issues around international development and how we can more effectively come alongside and ally with peoples in the developing world who are seeking to improve their economic position. So I'm very excited that today our conversation will be about kind of bringing these two things together about blockchain technology and its implications for international development. And I'm pleased to introduce our guest for this discussion. Charles Hoskison is the CEO and founder of IOHC, the blockchain and engineering company responsible for the Cardano blockchain, one of the most popular blockchains in the world. He is also one of the co-founders of Ethereum, now the world's second biggest cryptocurrency. IOHK is heavily involved in blockchain adoption in developing countries, specifically such as Ethiopia. So, Charles, thank you so much for joining us, and give us the introduction. What does this technology mean for developing countries specifically as they seek to improve their economic position?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk to people around the world. You know, actually, our president and chief of staff is based in London, Ontario. So we have a lot of Canadians floating around in the company, and they do interesting things. And I try to come up north from time to time. I'm based down here in Colorado. So wait, before we go any further, we got to talk a little bit of hockey, right? You're in Colorado. Well, the Avalanche, of course, are going to win. But you gave us Patrick Ross.
You got the refs on your side, right? And that's the system is rigged against that's the problem, right? Anyways, thanks for this is going to make it so much harder to agree with anything you say now, knowing that you're an Avalanche guy. But anyways,
well, I live in Colorado. What do you expect? You know,
fair enough. Well, I live in Edmonton, so there. Yeah, we go.
But if it's any consolation, like all the great Avs players were Canadian. Like we got Patrick Waugh and all those things from back in the day. I remember when they won the Stanley in '96, and I think they won again in like the early 2000s, and those were some fun games. All right, well, let's talk crypto. So where did we all come from? So in the 1980s, after the internet was really starting to get rolling, a lot of people were discussing, well, what does this all mean for the world? And so there was first this concept of, well, if you could move information instantaneously anywhere between people, it's really going to change the information economy. And we're going to move from this building cities around repositories of information like palaces, libraries, universities, and everybody can just live anywhere they want and they can communicate with anybody real time. They even wrote things like the whole Earth catalog and all these other ideas. Well, a subgroup of those cypherpunks who were thinking about, well, what does this move for information? We're also thinking about, well, what does this mean for value? Money, financial transactions, these types of things. And so this group of people started coming up with ideas of how do we create a financial system that is global first, always on, digital, and behaves kind of like how the internet behaves. The problem is that that's super hard in practice because you don't want central authorities to be in power with it. So it started kind of a 30-year quest from the 1980s to about 2009 to figure out how do you do e-money or the electronic movement of value between people who don't know each other without needing a central intermediary. And that's where Bitcoin basically came from. It was the kind of the capstone of that long arc quest that the Wei Dais and the Nick Szabos and the other people like Phil Zimmerman were talking about, and so forth. And Hal Finney was another actor there. There was DigiCash, who was another prominent cryptographer. I'm forgetting his name right now. It'll come back to me. But, it comes out. And then immediately after it came out, people started saying, well, that'll never work because it has to obtain market value. You have to get a population. You have to somehow in a centralized way get a community around it. And it took about 5 years for Bitcoin to get to that point. So from 2009 to about 2014, we saw that grow. And then eventually Bitcoin got over $1 billion. And then suddenly, once that infrastructure was in place, people said, okay, this is here to stay, but we'd like to do useful, interesting things with it. And so, for example, maybe I'd like to issue my own currency. Maybe I'd like to connect art to something. Maybe I'd like to do land titles and deeds. Maybe I want to do water rights with it. Maybe I want to build a supply chain with this. Maybe I want to vote with this and vote online, these types of things. Okay, that's great. But the problem is that Bitcoin didn't really let you do that. So a second generation had to come, and that's really what the Ethereum revolution was about. And that was the idea of the smart contract. And once you had that, you had programmability. It's kind of like when JavaScript came to the web browser, you went from these static websites, which are pretty and they have text and pictures, to interactive websites like Amazon and Facebook and YouTube and Google and so forth. We have a two-way relationship. You can do things with them. Okay. Well, once you have programmability, then suddenly you have things like decentralized finance, the DeFi revolution. You have things like NFTs that a lot of people have heard of. You have oracles, you have stable coins, all these other terms that have come out, ICOs, STOs. You have an acronym salad that basically comes through. So then the problem is that, well, that's awesome. It doesn't scale to the needs of millions to billions of users, and it's not really useful for a drop-in replacement for a legacy financial system. So you can't just take Ethereum and you put it into Ethiopia or Kenya or Botswana or Burundi, or put it into a local community like an indigenous population and say, okay, here you go. You can run a whole governance system with it. Because the operating cost is too high. The protocols don't scale like that. So then the next generation came and they really focused on that design space. That's where the Cardanos come from and the Solanas and these other things. And so this industry is now about 13 years in. We've gone from nothing to over 100 million people. And at the all-time high, there was over $2 trillion of value. There's still about 1.2 trillion in value. There's hundreds of marketplaces across the world. And it's really starting to touch on everything. It's touching on trade. It's touching on identity management. It's touching on voting, in addition to the financial stuff of just the movement of value. And even nation states now, for example, like El Salvador, has adopted Bitcoin as a national currency. So it's created a really cool global conversation of where is all of this going and how do we resolve some hard problems like governance problems, regulatory problems, and ultimately, how can these systems be used to build better marketplaces that are egalitarian at their heart? The cool thing about protocols is they don't care where you're born, what language you speak, what the color of your skin is. They don't care about any of these details. All they care about is you follow the protocol. So everybody has equal access, regardless of their money. And every business has equal access. So the Exxon Mobils of the world have the same access as the local farmer. The billionaire has the same access as the poor person living in the streets of Toronto. They all use the exact same system in that respect. And we've never really had that before. And we've never had that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in every single nation at the same time. And everybody gets to interact with it. So it's a really cool space.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And yet maybe it's still like at a stage where it's sort of hard to wrap your mind around a little bit. At least that's sort of what I find. Like, but if I can maybe try to simplify
Sure.
what we're talking about, I mean, you use the term sort of smart contracts, right? So this is you've got a ledger, you've got a clear trackable system that isn't subject to manipulation, where you can move resources within it, but you can also do other things with it. It's a set of technology that allows you to that essentially provides a level of certainty and reliability and is more resistant to fraud and manipulation. Is that the upside here?
I think you lose when you talk about the technology, because nobody really talks about TCP/IP, and nobody talks about the underlying architecture and technology of the web. I mean, engineers do and other people do, but you really have to start from the applications. Like, what problems are these solving?
Okay.
So, for example, there's a big global conversation. I was just at the Milken Institute in California. We have all these world leaders there and other big people, and they talk about ESG and COP26. And what do we do about global warming? What do we do about sustainability? What do we do about basic things like, if you say it's organic, how do you know it's organic? Facts and claims, especially when you live in a global community. So even if your country is doing a great job, your country trades, your country has people coming and going, there's products all around, you have to sell into other marketplaces. So how do you work all that stuff out? So how do I, as a consumer, know that the things I'm putting into my body, the land that I'm standing on, the things that people are claiming, whether they have credentials or not, the people I'm doing business with are reputable, credible? These are basic problems. And they get really hard when you go from a single nation state to a global community, because a regulator in a nation state can't control the actions of another nation. They can try, and sometimes they succeed through transnational agreements, but the velocity of commerce, the things that are happening, is just simply too vast and voluminous to be able to actually deal with that in any reasonable way. So the point of blockchain technology, the point of the cryptocurrency space, is saying, well, maybe we can be that trust engine, that connecting tissue that you can then build consumer experiences, corporate experiences, and government experiences on top of, that can act as that auditor, act as that immutable ledger. And things like smart contracts and all these other details are just the execution details of how do you actually accomplish that? How do you encode those types of things? For example, I know you're voting right now. How do you know that the voting system people use has high integrity? Well, in America, I would love to have the ability to know that my vote was counted. I'd love to know that my vote was counted the way I thought it was counted. And I'd like to know that the integrity of the entire election system is preserved. In other words, no more people voted than people registered, and everybody who registered was lawful to register. Very simple request. A democratic system requires our belief for this. Right now, in most modern democracies, we're told, trust us. Don't worry, we got to figure it out. You can't audit it. You can't verify it yourself. When you move to a blockchain system, you remove central institutions in the audit and oversight. What you do is you build into the system itself the self-auditing capabilities, that inclusive accountability where you can verify those types of things. So not only can you vote online, but then also you can check and verify that the vote was correct, and you can check and verify the integrity of the entire system is preserved. Turns out it's the same problem. Once you start thinking that way, then you start asking, well, what other parts of society can we do this with? Government spending. Can I track where all my money goes? Taxation collection. You can look at these things for compliance purposes, like the automation of compliance. How do I know the funds that I'm getting are lawful if I'm running a bank or an exchange? Ordinarily, you have KYC and AML and all these arcane processes. And when you screw it up, you get fined. Well, what if the settlement of the transaction is compliance, and you can program all of that in? So I think what you need to do is go specific and find what's important to the individual, and say, all right, what problem can we solve that we couldn't solve before? And it could be as simple as, I'm going skiing in Aspen, Colorado, and I tumbled down the hill and broke my leg. And now the doctors there need to get my medical records from Ottawa. How do I broker them and move them across the border, especially if you're unconscious? To something as complicated as, we have a multinational trade deal with 5 big companies and 3 governments involved. And how do we structure a deal to keep everybody honest and have an audit and oversight layer to make sure that people can't cheat in that consortium? The point of our industry is to build a stack of technology that can service both ends of the spectrum with one universal, and give every single person access to those.
Yeah. So I think key takeaways then is you're saying, I think a lot of people, like, they really want to understand the mechanics of the technology, and you're saying, okay, let's relax that impulse, because most of us don't understand the mechanics of most technology we use most of the time. Anyways, I don't know how my computer works. All these other things that we sort of take for granted. I don't know how an elevator works, but I know what it's for, and that I can use it. And you're describing this technology that we now have. that provides an immutable ledger and therefore can provide trust across transactions.
Right.
The interesting thing, I guess, is that I think there's a lot of mistrust of that technology. Ironically, that there's when you talk to people about things like online voting, you kind of some of this new emerging technology, immediately there's this question of, well, how do we know it's secure, right? Because it's like conceptually harder to see. Whereas if when you're voting in person, you're just just checking you can more easily perceive the process of your vote, how it's being counted, and so forth. So, how do we get around then in a technology that is designed for verification and trust, this sort of instinctive fear that people have that they cannot trust something that is that is like less tangible?
Yeah, that's a great question. So trust is expensive to create, and it's very easy to lose. And when you lose it quickly. A great example, look at, the health institutions. They spent many decades building up lots of trust, and then a pandemic happens, and there are some people that have lost a lot of faith in health institutions across the world, from the WHO to the CDC and so forth. So the key to building trust, I think, is ubiquitousness. So it was very difficult for people to trust cell phones and smartphones until everybody had one and started using them. And they would just become an integral component of their lives. And then and only then could you build an Uber or an Airbnb or, these types of things that were connected to those facilities and services. So that's one dimension of it, is the consumerization of it and the familiarity of it. And you'll still find, though, that there are tranches of people that will never trust those systems. My grandfather still does not have a smartphone and barely uses the internet. And so, he's 90 years old. He's kind of aged out of those innovations. And that's why you need hybrid systems where you can't just fully embrace one. You need to have both. So for voting, you let people vote in paper, but you also then let people have the option to vote online, and you consolidate both systems. The other side is the oversight. So what is the adversarial model for these types of systems? And you'll find that decentralization has a very high burden because you have a huge attack surface. Anyone in the world can try to attack Bitcoin at any time. Anyone in the world can try to attack Cardano at any given time. So given that you have such a huge attack surface and everybody's trying to break it, if it survives 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that's much better than a centralized system that tends not to get attacked surviving, because you've already gotten a lot of the bugs and kinks. And that's the magic of the open source principle. This is kind of something like Cherkov's law in cryptography. That it's an analogous concept. It says the security of a system should only rely on the secrecy of the keys, not on obscuring the protocol. You want the protocol to be publicly known, because then everybody could try to break it, and then you end up getting significantly more reliable, resilient systems. So you look at Bitcoin, for example, 13 years of history there. 100 million plus users have touched it, played with it, and everybody, including national security agencies and governments, have tried in some way to co-opt, corrupt, or break the system, and it stayed very resilient in that respect. So that's a certain burden of proof that will convince government actors and Fortune 500 actors to start taking it seriously. Then what ends up happening is they start vouching for it and putting their own brands and reputations on top of it. So a consumer may not trust Bitcoin or Cardano, but they might trust Microsoft or Google or Apple. And what ends up happening is when these services use that as part of their technology and white label it, you get both benefits. You get a trusted consumer brand, but then you also, on the back end, get the value of decentralization and the resilience of the system as a whole. So that's kind of where we're at. We're in the gangly teens of the cryptocurrency industry, where we've started to actually have the real global conversation. Global regulation is happening. People are working with the systems. They're building things at scale of millions of people. And we're starting to have a conversation of how do you get consumers to love it? Some never will. They'll be left out. Legacy systems are required for them, and it's moral to do that. But most will slowly move over, and they're going to move over when something of their comfort zone moves over. Maybe Facebook supports it, or maybe Gmail supports it, or maybe it's now a new icon on their cell phone or something like that. Or other people are first adopters who are already in the crypto space, and they just bring people in through different means. Like no one in the art community, music community cared at all about crypto until NFTs came. And now that NFTs are here, you have Metallica and, Snoop Dogg and all these other people having conversations about NFTs, and they're trying to bring their fans in and build businesses on top of it in one way or the other. So you kind of have to wait also for the technology to catch up and solve a problem in a particular vertical. And once that occurs, then you end up getting consumerization and adoption and ultimately consumer trust in the process. Right.
But one of the things, and this is, I guess, where let's transition to talking about the developing world specifically, that there is less incentive for individuals to go through the process of adopting new technology if they feel that the current technology is more or less working fine, right? So people who are, I think broadly speaking, people that are more likely to invest in Bitcoin are also those who are more likely to be quite concerned about inflation and central banking policies, right? So you kind of have this sense where, and I mean, we can see it with the technology of Zoom existed prior to the pandemic, but people weren't using it, and now people are using it because there was a need to use it. So, it seems then, in terms of what you're talking about the value of the guarantee built into blockchain technology, the trust that's protected within the system. That this provides particular value in countries where there are rule of law issues, where individuals struggle with access to banking, where there is sort of a generally lower level of trust in institutions. Is that why we're seeing perhaps more eager adoption in some cases in the developing world of this kind of technology?
Yeah, big concern of ours is economic identity and how do you bank the unbanked. It's been a life mission of mine, and for almost 10 years now I've been chasing it. I did a TED talk on it back in 2014, and hopefully we can do that talk again and say we've moved the chains, we've made some progress. But in general, when you look at the developing world, there's a kind of a convergence of bad forces. First, you have very usurious marketplaces. So you have remittances at 15%, you have lending at 85%. You have a lot of predatory behavior. Second, you have exclusion from the global financial order, meaning that it's very difficult for people, even if they want to get a bank account and get economic identity, build a reputation, become creditworthy, and be respected in the global marketplace. Just think about the discrimination. If you have a business in Addis Ababa or in Nairobi, and you go to Silicon Valley and say, "Hey, would you like to invest in my startup?" No. We just don't know how to do business in that jurisdiction. Sorry. So all those global capital markets are basically excluding you. And so you have a really hard time lifting yourself up. It's not a ladder out of the hole. It's more like a pit full of cobras. You have to find a way to build your own ladder off of the cobra bones. It's tough. And then you also have geopolitical instability that robs you of the things that we take for granted in places like Canada or the United States, like stable currencies, stable education systems, stable governments, and so forth. So when you have those convergence of factors, it creates a perpetual poverty engine. And the only way to get out of it is to physically leave the jurisdiction and go to a more stable economy. And then what you do is you send money home, which is why you see so many remittance inflows into countries that suffer from this. Well, the point of crypto is saying, well, we can do better. So you don't have to trust the government. You don't have to trust the local currency. You don't have to trust the local marketplaces. You have a system that can come in the absence of trust of those central institutions, build up a parallel economy, and then suddenly you can do loans now. Suddenly you can do low-cost remittances now. Suddenly you can start putting your business up on a blockchain and constrain it by the same rules that the people in the United States or other places are following. So that's why we've seen a lot of excitement, a lot of discussion, a lot of adoption, not just from locals in these jurisdictions, but from people who actually want to do good. So if you want to do direct foreign investment, or you're an NGO, you want to help out, you're an aid program, you're somebody who's there to do something, you want to make sure that it's maximally effective. So you can start saying, well, if we're going to do this, let's deploy these types of systems, because in practice, it's going to ensure that we lower the waste, fraud, and abuse, and corruption, and other problems that tend to come. And then also we can get better data on what's happening in that marketplace so we can make data-driven decisions about these things. So from our part, we're in Ethiopia, we're in Kenya, we're other places. And in Kenya, we're doing a microfinance project with partners there. In Zanzibar, we're working with partners there for a telecommunications product to build a completely new ISP. And Ethiopia, we're doing government identity. We're actually working with the Ministry of Education to roll out a credential management system that doesn't require people to use a central authority to verify and validate credentials. So regardless of whether the government systems are on or off, where people are, they can verify they have a degree. Simple stuff. But once you build those things, you create agency, economic identity for people. And then what they're able to do is use that agency, that economic identity, to interface with the global marketplaces. And it can be as simple as preserving and protecting the fruits of their labors, whether that be intellectual property or art or whatever it is, to as complex as actually getting new forms of venture capital and getting actual investments into their businesses that they previously could not get without leaving the jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. Let's make it concrete for folks by maybe digging into a specific example. You talked about a microfinance program that you're running in Ethiopia, and I guess for those who don't know,
in Kenya.
Kenya, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So microfinance is, for those who don't know, it's the idea of basically providing small loans to people who are quite poor, who perhaps wouldn't be able to get a loan through a traditional bank, recognizing that access to credit is really key for giving people the ability to build themselves up out of poverty. If they have ideas, they want to make investments, they want to move themselves forward, having that initial access to capital really makes a difference. So you're providing microfinance using blockchain. Tell us about maybe how that works, and maybe if you have an example of a particular a person or success story you can use
we're going to roll out a program the second half of this year. We're working with a company called Possessia in that particular instance. And so there are many components to making this work. First, you have to actually get a loan book. You have to onboard people into it. And thus, you also need people that gain some form of identity. So we have another product that we've constructed called Atala Prism. This is the identity product that we use with Fortune 250 companies like Dish or the Ethiopian government. So basically has this thing called a DID, a decentralized identifier, and we give people those credentials. We let them create them, and then you can build reputation, and you can do know your customer and anti-money laundering and all kinds of things on top of that to ensure that they have identity. Now, the power of DIDs is that they're agnostic to the infrastructure, so they can work in legacy systems. They can work on Bitcoin, they can work on Ethereum. They also work on Cardano, the blockchain we're deploying this on. But then once they're deployed, they now have identity, and then you can build reputation. So you can combine more traditional microfinance scoring for creditworthiness, collateralized and uncollateralized on top of that, and then you can create a marketplace. And so then it's like a Kiva-like experience. People can actually see specific people, say, oh, that person looks good, and click a button and send them a loan. And then that person will repay over time. Usually these loans are 30 to 90 days in microfinance. And they can pay with a cryptocurrency asset. So usually you like to use a stable coin, so something pegged to the US dollar or to the Canadian dollar or to the euro or some asset that tends to be somewhat inflation resistant. So there's predictability in the repayment terms. So it's a little bit of the old stuff. So it's still the standard microfinance networks and finding people, and some of the new stuff like getting a DID and connecting it to a person and creating a blockchain-based reputation system. And then also, not instead of using conventional banking system to wire money through SWIFT and all this stuff, you're actually doing a peer-to-peer loan. So someone specifically, let's say in Argentina or in China or Japan or wherever, is actually finding that person, clicking a button, sending them that. And then that person, when they repay directly to you. So by removing those financial intermediaries, that's what significantly lowers the interest rates. You go from 85% to significantly lower rates over time, especially as capital availability increases relative to the loan book. So we've been working with Possession for a while. We've done some microloans, a few $100,000 through their traditional portfolio to get an understanding of how that works. And now we're building all the plumbing out and getting all that set up so that we can roll out with Possession basically a product that people can use, and you just integrate it to a cryptocurrency wallet, and then people can just start collecting things, clicking things. And what's so cool about it is that you're not giving loans to some abstract entity like company X. It's a person. You can see their picture, you can see their story, just like Kiva, and you actually can click lend. So that's just an example of a real life product. And what's so cool about it, if it works, it's not charity. You still make a profit. It's obviously a high risk endeavor because it's microfinance, but you can then start collecting all that data, tracking it, and that lending history sticks with their identity that they've been given. So over time, that can be used to help open a business. Over time, that could be used for venture capital, for admissions decisions into universities, travel decisions, all kinds of things. It's low cost to do it too. The whole totality of the relationship has been something in the 6-figure range for us to develop and foster. And if it's successful, it's something that we can use as part of a larger microfinance fund. And it goes all levels. You can do funds for it. You can also create structured financial products for it that can be sold in regulated marketplaces. You can do all kinds of things with it. And that's just Kenya. Model could be franchised and taken to any place. It can be taken to Ghana, Nigeria, and other places. But you have to start somewhere. And Kenya has a very evolved microfinance marketplace, and they have reasonable bank penetration and crypto penetration. So it's a good safe harbor jurisdiction to explore these things.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I've seen things that are a little bit like this, but where you can go online and see a microfinance opportunity and look at the individuals but you're sending traditional dollars through the internet, which so the transaction costs are just much higher, and there's not the same, and the verification is based on whoever's got the website and giving you information about the individual. So yours is a development of that by making it much easier to transfer the money and having a verification process in place. There's a little bit of the old, little bit of the new. So in the old sense, you still need a local MFI partner that has the local licenses. You still need a notion of how to do KYC and AML. You still need a notion of a credit scoring. So these types of things still need to be in place. But if you're clever about how you structure it, you can have much more agility and much lower onboarding costs than conventional systems. And then you're lending, let's say, a stable coin. Well, on their side, they needed the ability to convert that stable coin into the local currency. Great. Well, you need partners then that are on that side that can do that at a low conversion fee, usually under 1% for that conversion fee. So that's why we chose Kenya as a marketplace to explore and pilot these ideas, because all those pieces of plumbing happen to be there to enable that. But what's really cool about it is once it's running, it's completely decentralized. And then more and more people will do it because they're having a good outcome with it. And there's also a good social component to it. So it creates an abundance of capital that enters that jurisdiction, which means that the interest rates fall. So then you start seeing a normalization of the interest rates in the developing world with the developed world, which is unheard of. You have 85% interest rates in Kenya right now, and for microfinance loans. Yeah. And United States and Canada, what is it? 4%, 5%, these types of things for loans. So that's a humongous delta. More capital, more availability, they start normalizing, so they become less predatory inside those jurisdictions. Yeah. Yeah, this is so important, right? This is and this is really exciting for me to hear about, because I think too often we talk about and think about international development, or we frame it as sort of a charity. Well, somebody else, the heroes, the saviors from somewhere else, and the reality is we need to think about and understand development as people who are developing being the heroes of their own story, and we can play a supporting role by trying to say what are the barriers and removing them. And one of the key barriers is that access to finance. I mean, it's sort of a given here that most people starting businesses would go out and get investors and borrow money, and they would be able to get credit and use that to build on their idea. But if you don't have basic access to credit, then inevitably it's only the people who already possess a huge amount of existing capital that can go forward. So
which creates that systemic and perpetual inequality in society, because the haves will always be okay, but then you have lots of have-nots, and they have no ladder to get into the haves category.
Upward mobility if we're talking about through entrepreneurship, it requires that access to credit very often. So this is about facilitating that tool. But in practice, I guess the point you're making is that it's still in the process of development because people still have to make that conversion on the other side. I suppose in your ideal world, people would be able to receive a loan through blockchain using virtual currency and use that same currency to go out and buy the inputs for their business and then
that'll
money
happen
back.
Organically. So once those more marketplaces develop and then people realize that convertibility is there, then people start treating that like cash. M-Pesa was a great example of that. So the minute people started realizing that cell phone minutes could be used as a currency and other people would accept them, there was no notion of trying to sell them into a currency or convert them. You just use them for commercial transactions. And it became a currency unto itself. So there's in many ways a preference over a dollar-backed stablecoin over a local currency because it actually is hedged against the inflation usually of those local currencies. So people would actually want to use that as a store of value and a means of exchange over the local currency, and velocity will form, especially if it's a seamless experience. You just tap cell phones together, or it's very easy to move these types of things. It's safer. If you go to some of these places, like we do a lot of business in Ethiopia, it's still a mostly cash economy. To do anything of substance, you have to carry a ton of money with you, like a bag full of bear, and it's not safe to do those types of things. And so I'd much rather have digital transactions where you take a cell phone out, you tap it, enter a password, and it's done. Nobody knows you have the money. Nobody knows you're traveling with that kind of money, and there's less friction in those commercial transactions. So it's an organic thing that tends to happen, but you have to kind of prime the pump, and that convertibility is very important. But once convertibility is established, then usually it becomes a currency unto itself.
Yeah. You had mentioned earlier specifically the issue of remittances. Remittances are very important here in Canada. We've got large diaspora communities. We've got people that come as temporary workers, and being able to send financial support to family members in their country of origin is really important to them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of fees involved with that. And my sense is that the fees are proportionately higher the smaller your level of transaction. If you're able to send a large amount of money at once, then you can do a little better. But for a lot of folks who come here as temporary workers, for example, they're sending small amounts of money back home as they earn it, because there's that constant need on the part of those they're supporting. Where is the technology at right now for people to be able to send remittances through blockchain, and where do you think it will go in the near future?
For most of the third generation protocols, so for the Cardanos and these others, they have the lowest fees. And the way the technology is built, the fees go down over time because they get more throughput. You can bundle more things together. And they have a lot of cool technology like payment channels. But for the most part, fees are in the dollars to pennies when you talk about moving value, regardless of the amount of value. And over time, the next 5-10 years, those fees will go much lower, like sub pennies per transaction. So it's just incomparable when you compare a wire transfer charge or a remittance charge compared to the value transfer. So usually it's less about the transaction fee and it's more about the convertibility fee. So if you still do have a need to convert into a local currency, that's usually where you get screwed. Like that can be 10%, that can be 20% or something like that. We see that in the Philippines and other places. So those markets are still evolving. They're getting more efficient. And then, especially with stable coins, they're pretty good because you don't have to deal with the volatility too much, and there's no urgency of conversion. And there's larger marketplaces from because they're usually backed by things. So in case of Kenya, we found ways to get those fees under 1%. And doesn't matter if it's for a loan or for a remittance, that's the same structure in that respect. So both the fee on the wire and the fee of conversion is sub 1%. Now compare that with normal remittances, that's 8 to 15%. Is the world average. And so that's, a humongous delta in that respect. But then there's a lot of other things you have to worry about. So there's the storage of the funds. So when you send money to people and they go Western Union or something like that, if they get a lot of cash, they're putting a big target on their back, especially in their community. So Where do you store it? How do you handle it? There's also use of these things. When you send it, we always think, oh, it's Alice sending to Bob. It's the daughter sending money home to mom in the Philippines or something like that, or in Saudi Arabia or wherever the family lives that they're remitting to. Well, what if you're sending it to a group? What if you're sending it to a business? How do you know that there's proper checks and balances and controls there? That's a lot harder to do with cash. You have to just pick somebody and say, well, Bob over there is the one in charge, and let's hope he does a good job. With crypto, you actually have fine level control over access. There's things like called multi-signature support. And that means a group of people have to come together to be able to spend that money. The other thing is that you have transparency on the use of funds as the sender. So if I send you cash, you get that cash. I don't know if you're using to buy school books or alcohol. I don't know if you're using to buy groceries or going to a strip club. I have no idea. But with this type of a system, you can create all kinds of structures to track and trace the use of funds. So the same thing that could track the government's use of money with blockchain technology could also be used to track the use of money with a food stamp or a voucher or a remittance transaction to somebody. You know, a lot of people don't want to give money to aid organizations because they just don't know where the money is going to go. And they think there might be waste, fraud, and abuse. And we see things like what happened in Haiti, for example, and a lot of that money was lost. So they say, oh, well, all of them do that. We shouldn't do it. Well, what if you had a system where you can actually look yourself and verify that that was used to buy fertilizer or buy food or buy medical goods or these types of things, and see the actual supply chains and track those things and so forth. So it's not just a restoration in terms of cost for remittance, but it's the entire experience in question of these types of things of, you know, what do we do? You can even create real-time matching programs. So for example, if a government finds out if a crisis occurs, like a hurricane or a horrible natural disaster, like the fires Australia had or something like that, you could do things like saying, hey, we Canadians are generous, so the government has made a decision that all funds that are being remitted will do matching funds for it. So you can see those remittance transactions go through, and you can just send money to the same address. You don't even have to know the parties involved or talk to them or anything like that. They just have twice as much money show up.
Yeah.
So it's really cool when you think about the applications and how you can have that fine level control from a policy perspective, and also as a giver and a receiver to control these things. Yeah,
we have had an issue in the past with matching programs in Canada in terms of the government saying, in the context of certain disasters or in response to conflicts. Most recent example being the invasion of Ukraine. The government created a matching program, but it was only to one organization, the Red Cross, and you know they do great work. But I think you had a lot of people kind of asking the question, when you match donations to one organization and not others, effectively you it wasn't as much of an issue in the context of Ukraine because there was just so much generosity right away that the program was maxed out right away. But in other cases we've seen where a matching program has the effect of directing money to certain organizations instead of others. So with the kinds of systems you talk about, you could have it would be much easier. I mean, it could be done anyways, but it would be much easier to offer that broader matching program. Can we just drill down on the Philippines example though, because this is certainly a major recipient of remittances from Canada specifically. So you said, unlike Kenya, in the Philippines, there's a very high cost of conversion on the other end. So less likely people would use blockchain to transfer money from, say, Canada to the Philippines, because although the cost of moving it is much less, the cost of converting it into local currency, on the other hand, is much higher. Why is the conversion cost in that particular example high? And are there things that either the government of Canada or the government of the Philippines or other actors could do to try to bring down that conversion cost?
Yeah, it's the same in Ethiopia and other places. So it really comes down to things like capital controls, the ease of movement of capital, banking access, regulated exchanges. So if you live in an economy where there are regulated crypto exchanges and they're very liquid and they have a lot of velocity of money, then you have a lot of competition in the conversion. And so if I am a local converter, I can't really charge 40% more than what the exchange is charging, because the consumer can create an account and do it themselves, and other people will come in and undercut me. But if there's very few of these access points in a less developed marketplace, then I kind of have a regional monopoly. And so I can crank the price up to these things. And so those are usually the factors. And it's not exclusive to the Philippines. There's Indonesia. There's many jurisdictions where, especially in less affluent areas, as you go further and further away from hyper-urbanized places like Manila to, let's say, Mindanao or, smaller islands, you're just going to get that natural regional monopoly issue, and it's a liquidity issue. So some of that is just regulatory reform, and the Philippines has to do that. And those markets have historically had a lot of challenges. I can't even, as an American, buy property there, and so there's things like that. And then some cases, it's in the case of Ethiopia in particular, capital controls have always been a horrible and barrier to direct foreign investment and business, and it's very difficult to get bear out of the country and dollars in and out of the country. You can put them in, but hard to get them out, these types of things. And so that has a huge impact. And so in some cases, governments who have capital controls view cryptocurrencies as an adversarial agent because they're a way to evade the capital controls. You can basically circumvent the loops that they have, and it hurts them with their whole master plan in that respect. In other cases, it's just markets shut down. For example, in Ukraine, it's you can send crypto in and it works, but those normal marketplaces aren't really running the way that they need to run right now, especially in Eastern Ukraine. So, of course, there's going to be huge deltas, not just on the conversion of cryptocurrencies, but actually conversion of dollars as well into other currencies. And so those things occur. And that's kind of a ephemeral concern. It'll fade over time as those markets renormalize and stabilize. But I suppose just the creation of marketplaces, that's how you solve it. Exchanges, infrastructure is the single most important part. And what's interesting is the introduction of CBDCs, central bank issued digital currencies, because that's the first time that sovereign currencies start talking to and interacting with cryptocurrencies in the same format. Once that occurs, then that conversion can be done in a completely digital way. It's not if, it's when the world will move to CBDCs, because there are tax advantages and trade advantages and compliance advantages over going to a cashless economy. So when these things live together, then we have things called DEXs, decentralized exchanges, and then they can basically be used together, and you can seamlessly move from one currency to another currency. In the interim, stablecoins are kind of acting as a central bank issued digital currency. So things like Tether and USDC and so forth. And as long as people trust those and are happy with those, then they have high velocity, and it's very easy to move between one to the other. And the fees are very low. They're less than 1% in most cases.
I see. And all of this is only an issue, I guess, if people feel the need to convert to the local currency. If they don't need to do that, if they can buy the goods and services that they need using a digital currency, then there's no conversion issue. Is that right?
Yeah. And usually you see a lot of bi-monetary systems when you deal with the developing world. So usually they use the dollar as the store of value. They keep their savings in that. And then when they want to go buy something, they convert at the time of purchase to that to go and buy something, because the local currency is unstable and it loses its value very quickly. So it's not good to keep your wealth inside that instrument.
Right. So can you just explain the El Salvador Bitcoin issue? So what's happening there, and how does that impact people being able to send money into the country?
So we flew down, met with Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and we had a lovely series of conversations with him. And most of the people in Bitcoin space have gone down there and met with him and talked to him. So what El Salvador did is they decided that they're going to have a bi-monetary system. So they say Bitcoin is a legal currency in El Salvador. And right now it's perceived as a store of value. So people can store wealth in it. But then they also still are dollarized. So people use the US dollars for transactions, remittances, and a litany of other services. But they created all the infrastructure and plumbing to be able to seamlessly move between Bitcoin and the dollar. So they have a system called Chivo, and basically it's slowly absorbing the entire legacy financial stack, and they're kind of running both currencies in parallel. So in practice, the vast, overwhelming majority of transactions in El Salvador are still in dollars, especially cash transactions, all in dollars. But more and more things are happening with the Bitcoin side of the system, and they're creating all kinds of plumbing to be able to easily move in and out. And their hope is eventually that the Bitcoin side can take over the remittance cycle between El Salvador and the United States. There's about 8 million El Salvadorans, 2 million of which live in the United States, 6 million live in El Salvador, and about 25% of their GDP is remittances from the United States into El Salvador. So that cycle is quite usurious. It's expensive to use, and it's inefficient. And so if they had crypto rails with the Shiba wallet, the way the government constructed it, it's free transactions. So you can send Bitcoin for free from one point to another point in network. So they've had some challenges, but they're evolving and growing. And what's more interesting is they've started a global conversation about nation states adopting Bitcoin. And they recently had a summit with 44 central banks and ministers of finance to come to El Salvador and actually have the discussion about adopting Bitcoin as the sovereign currency. And it contains some large countries like Egypt and Turkey and so forth. And it's part of a broader conversation of not only monetary innovation, but also what does it mean to have a sovereign currency that's deflationary? All modern monetary systems are fractional and inflationary. So you have an expectation that every year your money is worth less. When you adopt a Bitcoin-like system, it's intrinsically a deflationary currency. So you have an expectation that over time your money's worth more. It's the opposite. And that goes against the conventional wisdom of modern monetary theory. You know, they have this concept of a deflationary spiral. And they thought, in the 19th century, we ran this experiment. It doesn't work. So El Salvador is restarting the experiment in a different context, and will basically real time be able to see if it works for a nation state. And what does it mean for a saving economy instead of a consumption economy?
Yeah, this was some like the big. I recently read a biography of William Jennings Bryan, and this was sort of the big monetary policy debate of the late 19th, the early 20th century, right? Yeah. It was the and at the time the mavericks and the nonconformists were those who were saying we need to get off the gold standard and open up the
silver standard.
Yeah, exactly.
But by the way, that's where the Wizard of Oz came from. Originally, the gold brick road, the yellow brick road was gold, and then her shoes weren't ruby; they were actually silver shoes that she wore. So it was It was a story on the whole William Jennings Bryan silver standard thing.
I didn't know that. Okay, that's so fascinating. Such an interesting time, and sort of the categories of debate are so different than ours. They sort of challenge the way you think about certain things, but I guess the sort of consensus is that the deflationary approach to economics at the time, the lack of willingness to expand the money supply that sort of shifted into the 20th century, with Keynes and others, that contributed to the kind of stark inequality that we associate with the Gilded Age, right? That those who had money, it was going up in value, and they had less of an incentive to use that money than in an economy with modest inflation, right? And so, I mean, maybe comment on that. Please.
If you look at like the Bretton Woods Agreement, how the world standards work, it's important to point out that the gold standard paid for World War II and the Apollo program and all these other things, and we had relatively constrained inflation, and yet we still had a strong middle class in the United States.
Right.
And then when you look at, there was all this wealth inequality in the 19th century. No, hang on, let's be very clear about something. Throughout the course of all of human history, there was always gargantuan wealth inequality. You had kings and religious leaders and lords, and they had all the wealth, and 99.9% of everybody else was just insanely poor. And when you look at the Industrial Revolution, this was the first time that people were actually going from poor to rich. And it wasn't just a few people. There were literally millions of people doing that. Somehow then blaming the monetary system of the time for the fact that we actually had more people escaping poverty is just a bizarre misrepresentation of history. And it really didn't, I would challenge it completely. Deflationary systems, of course, bias towards people who have assets, and their assets are worth more. But the alternative is that you're creating an economy where people with political connections and insider information benefit. When you live in an inflationary economy, people who get to spend the money first and have a better ability to deal with inflation are the ones who make massive money because they can trade their inflationary money for deflationary assets like land or other things. And so those are almost always the billionaires, the political class, and other actors. And the poor people, their wages do not scale proportionate with inflation, which is why when you see inflation go up, the people who get wiped out are the poor people, not the rich. When you live in a deflationary economy, that's a completely different thing. And usually that has really constrained understanding. It's a supply and demand mechanic. It's more of a natural market mechanic. The other thing is it prevents politicians from robbing people. It's really politically inconvenient to go and say, we're going to raise taxes. It's not really easy to get reelected when you're that guy. But if you subtly tinker with monetary policy and basically create money out of thin air, then you've achieved the same ends of raising taxes, but you don't take the political fallout of it. Right.
So I think it's fair to point out that deflationary system, or where you have a fixed and unchanging currency, that eliminates the possibility of political manipulation of a currency. But generally, what we have is independent central bank policies in the Western world. We still have the very much the principle that politicians shouldn't interfere in currency decisions. But I guess that someone would question how well that's actually working in practice. But
look at the last 20 years, the United States. We've gone from $4.5 trillion of national debt to $32 trillion plus of national debt. And now we have inflation that's almost double digits. When they said it was always going to be around 3% with all this inflation targeting. I mean, that's why Ben Bernanke got his job at the central bank. He was the big inflation targeting guy, and he's we know how to target inflation. We know how to keep it under 3%. There's too much political manipulation in these things and fiscal manipulation in these things, and basically we live in an age now of massive national debts and perpetual deficits. And the other problem is that what happens when you pay real interest rates on these things? Like if you look at a 3% interest rate on the current U.S. national debt, that is more money in interest that you owe than the entire money we spend on the U.S. military, $1 trillion a year. And that's just 3%. What if it's 5%? What if it's 7%? I mean, that's then more than all the tax receipts than the entire government gets. You can't afford that as a nation state. And then the problem is you're running a deficit, so you have to print more money to be able to pay for this. So you keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And, that's the predictable reality when a government is unconstrained and they have unlimited printing authority. And they say, well, we'll just keep the central bank somewhat independent, but you never really can. And if that's your goal, why aren't you going to crypto? Because you get true independence. No one in the world, not me, not Blockstream, anybody can go and manipulate Bitcoin. No one in the world can go and manipulate the monetary policy of Cardano and change it and say, we're just going to print 10 billion ADA out of thin air. Good luck. You can't do it. And so if your goal is monetary independence, it feels like a cryptocurrency is the way to go. And we can have the inflationary deflationary debate. Sure. You can create an inflationary cryptocurrency and have it inflate perpetually at 3% and so forth. But what's problematic to me is that the facts and circumstances will change monetary policy radically. And the problem is it's always biased towards the rich and large companies against the poor and creates more inequality. As a final point, keep it simple for people. If you think of The Simpsons, it's a show we've all seen, we all know. There's something very subtle about The Simpsons that most people miss. Homer Simpson is married to Marge. He has 3 kids. He doesn't even have a high school degree, yet somehow he makes enough money to afford a home with 4 bedrooms and 3 baths, and he lives a middle-class lifestyle where his wife doesn't work. So we were in 1989 comfortable with the reality that a family of 5 could live off a single person who's not even college educated wages and live a comfortable middle-class life with 2 cars. Is that the reality most families face? No, both people are college educated. They both have jobs. They can barely afford their 2 kids. They're dead up to their eyeballs. And yet they make more on paper by a factor of 5 or 6 than Homer made working at the nuclear power plant. So there's something wrong with the money. It's the monetary system. And what they do is, it's just millionaires and billionaires rigging the system or so. They're taking advantage of the monetary system and the fact that money is losing its value at an unprecedented rate. Look at the price of real estate. You have too much money flowing. BlackRock has $9 trillion. So how much does it cost to buy a home in Toronto now? How much does it cost to buy a home in London, Ontario now? How much does it cost to buy a home in Denver, Colorado now? Places down the street here in Longmont that were $250,000 just 5 years ago are now $600,000 for the exact same house. Can the poor afford that? Can the middle class afford that? Have their wages gone up? No. And that asset inflation, where'd it come from? Big multinational companies big investment funds, governments, they're getting involved in the real estate markets. They're manipulating the real estate markets by purchasing and selling. That's why people get away with saying things like you can own nothing and be happy. Because it's reality. That's what the monetary system is pushing us into this you own nothing mindset.
This is a great conversation. I'd love to pursue the inflation conversation. It's very relevant to a lot of the things that are being said in Canada. I want to respect your time here. I want to just conclude on one question about international development. It seems the ideal you were talking about in terms of El Salvador before we kind of went on this inflation path, which is important as well. But the ideal is that that if I'm someone from El Salvador, right, I can go to Colorado and get a job, and I can send money back to support my mom, and not pay a transaction cost. That I can earn the equivalent of $100, and I can send back $100, and she gets $100 and can buy $100 worth of goods, and that means that. And the potential to do that is a great equalizer. It not only means that I can work in Colorado and send money back to El Salvador, it means that I can work in El Salvador for an American company and get paid directly without the kind of transaction costs or that the world of commerce across borders is just opened up to such an extent that entrepreneurs, workers, and family members can receive all the same benefits of commerce that would be available to someone that's just down the street. Is that the world we are moving towards?
Yeah, not only that, we're actually moving into the world where you have choice in your wealth. So normally I think in terms of dollars, or people think in terms of euros or whatever, but the world we're going to move into in the next 25 years is that you keep your wealth in a portfolio of things, maybe some silver, some gold, some Microsoft stock, loyalty points, advertising tokens, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, fractionalized ownership of your home, all of these things. And it's a portfolio. Then when you go to the supermarket or Starbucks or Tim Hortons, and you want to go buy something, let's say a coffee at Tim Hortons, you scan your phone and they get paid in what they want to be paid in. So let's say there's some Forex stuff that Tim Hortons is doing, and they need to stockpile a little bit more euros or something like that. So they get paid in euros. And that whole transaction end to end, let's say you paid in silver, they get euros. That whole thing is handled by decentralized marketplaces, and you always pay the lowest possible fee and price. And they're global 24/7 marketplaces that have high liquidity. That's the world we're moving towards. And then once you can move to a world like that, you have the individual choice of how do you want to separate your overall wealth. And then you can create liquidity in ways that are completely unimaginable, including future earnings. So let's say that you're a very talented young kid. And what you can do in the marketplaces of the future, let's say you're a phenomenal baseball player, is that you can pre-sell potential earnings playing baseball 10 years from now, and get that as basically a loan on the future. And people can trade that on marketplaces for you, maybe same for a movie actor or whatever. And then you've created liquidity today for something you may have in the future. And all of that can be done at a very personal level, or it can be done on a global scale. I just mentioned microfinance. Those are individual connections between people. But what if I go and buy up the whole loan portfolio? Then I can create a collateralized debt obligation, and I can suddenly create an organization and tranche it out and sell it like the CDOs we sell on Wall Street and so forth. Goldman Sachs can get involved suddenly in microfinance and a regulated marketplace and so forth. And what does that do? It creates more liquidity in that marketplace. You have more loans that can be serviced now. You see, so those are the markets we're moving towards. You're in the driver's seat for wealth and allocations. Everybody gets to decide what instruments they want to hold and be paid in, and what instruments they want to transact in. And you now have more choices in how you create liquidity for your life, your future earnings, and so forth. You're in the driver's seat.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. It's been so good to talk to you. This has really been fascinating for me, and I'm excited to see how these things will evolve and develop. And we're in opposition right now, but if we're successful in the next election, I'll certainly be looping back with you and saying, how can we explore further, at whatever point that is, How can we explore further unlocking the opportunity and the potential for international development that is presented by this technology?
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It's been great having you.
Yeah, and if you're ever up in Toronto, I think I'm going to be there for the Collision Conference at the end of the month. And so if you're in the area, I'd love to meet up with you guys. But this has been a heck of a lot of fun. I'll see you soon.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. So again, folks, Resuming Debate is my podcast. We're on all the major podcast platforms. If you like this conversation, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review. We'll see you again with another episode in 7 days.
Cheers.